Coming up next, BookTV presents Afterwards, an hour-long program where we invite guest hosts to interview authors. This week, Marine veteran Jane Blair and her first book, Hesitation Kills. In it, the Marine major, who rose from the enlisted ranks, details the chaos of war and highlights the combat performance of her squadron in Iraq. She talks with Representative Loretta Sanchez, founder and chair of the Congressional Caucus on Women in the Military.
So, Major Jane Blair, you are the first woman to write a book about your experience with respect to Iraq. Why? Why would you want to write a book?
Ma'am, thanks for the question. You know, I had a lot of reluctance actually about writing the book. You know, being a Marine, I think there's a natural tendency to want to not highlight my experiences, to just be a Marine and not kind of get involved with writing and all that. But I had kept a journal during my time in Iraq, and after I had gone through the notes, I realized, wow, I have some incredible stories about Marines in here that no one knows about. And so I felt it was almost an obligation for me to paint this portrait of my time in Iraq, but also highlight the stories of other Marines that I served with that I felt had done such incredible things, and no one was talking about it. And I thought, you know, I got to commit this to paper because all these stories are never going to get told if I don't write it.
And it's very interesting because our men and women who go to war, they rarely discuss what they've seen. And so it's really interesting to have read Hesitation Kills and to really see the perspective of a woman and how she deals with being in the military and how she deals with the whole aspect of war in the sense of, hey, I'm targeting someone here and they're going to be killed. So I'm sure there was some hesitation when others heard you were writing a book, like your colleagues and stuff, the other Marines, because, you know, my brother was a Marine, and they're pretty tight-lipped, and they're pretty entrenched, and they're pretty together, and there's this wall of silence, in a sense, of what happens among the Marines. How'd they treat you when you said, oh, I'm writing a book?
Actually, everyone was very encouraging because I had taken on sort of the unofficial role of being the squadron historian. So everyone knew I was kind of documenting everything that was happening as the war unfolded. And because my unit, which was one of the few unmanned aerial vehicle squadrons in the whole war, I mean, not just the Marine Corps, but throughout our combat operations, it was a really unique type of thing that we were doing at the time. It was the first time that we had employed UAVs or drones in this capability. And so I think people were very excited to get our story out, and I've received a lot of positive praise from my colleagues. Surprisingly, I thought they would be very critical of it, but I think that they're happy that their story is being told because it's highlighting a piece of history, really, that a lot of people don't know exists.
So take us through this because let's first discuss, you know, women have been in and have been in been participants really in all of our major wars, all the way from Betsy Ross making the American flag, if you will, to you. People know Jessica Lynch is the first POW woman taken in Iraq, for example. So let's go back to this whole issue because, as you know, one of the things I've been working on as the ranking woman on all the military issues in the House of Representatives in 15 years now, my entire service in the Congress, being on the Armed Services Committee, I've been really watching and seeing how the role of the woman is within the military ranks. So let's go back to something that's very important because you did something that I believe was very unique. You pushed the envelope in women being involved in combat in Iraq. So let's talk a little bit about, first of all, what combat means. Because, you know, some people think that women shouldn't be involved in combat. Talk to me a little bit about that.
You know, combat, it's an interesting thing because, you know, a lot of Marines think that to be in combat means you earn the combat action ribbon or you've reached a certain level or you have to be infantry in order to be in combat. But stepping back from that, if you look at just the definition of combat, it's any offensive action against enemy or foreign forces that results in some kind of conflict. You know, with that definition in mind, I think that we have no front line really right now in our current conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. And people who traditionally wouldn't be in these kind of combat roles are finding themselves very much on the front line. And that means support units that have females in them, and or untraditional roles that people didn't sign up to be in the infantry are finding themselves on this front line.
Right, because traditionally we felt that combat were the infantry units.
Exactly.
So now we find Jessica Lynch, who was a supply person on a convoy, and she finds herself in a firefight, and she finds herself as the first POW, which I want to go back to that in a little while, because of course you were involved with some of that. You see someone like Ruby Rubacava, who was up in Mosul on the day that the bomber got through the front line and went into the cafeteria, into the mess hall, and blew up the place. And she was one of the people blown up. So the reality is, I would say that's the front line. Almost any
Absolutely.
place is the front line now if you're in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan.
Yeah, and surprisingly, women are often unacknowledged for serving those roles because there's no combat roles for women. And whether that's because of current policy or just because women are suddenly finding that because of the way that the wars are, they're being put in that place. But I think there's a role for women in this capacity that they're finding, that really policymakers and the military are finding is very useful, such as being interrogator translators or serving as civil affairs, or being in the female engagement teams, which aids in helping the indigenous women and children in order to communicate with them.
In other words, when we go into Afghanistan, we go into the villages and we're trying to win the hearts and minds of the Afghan people, we find that women sometimes are more effective in going in and talking to the women. Of course, the guys can't go and talk to them, but they're more effective going into the villages and talking to them and getting good information about where the Taliban is or who's aiding the enemy, and more importantly, what the town really needs in order for it to be more cohesive and stand on its own so that we can get out of Afghanistan, if you will.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that women are bringing a new dynamic to the front line, and combat is always changing. The way that we conduct warfare is constantly evolving. We're no longer doing these first generation force on force type of maneuvers that require that we have total upper body strength, that we're hiking for miles, that we're doing hand-to-hand combat. And sure, those skills are very important, but right now on the battlefield, forces are finding themselves confronted not only as infantrymen, but they're also finding themselves in that role of both diplomat and peacemaker, where there's a necessity to have the role of discussing and finding out ways to have conflict resolution with whatever culture we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. And even on the athletic field, we found when we do the testing, sure, the guys have the upper body strength, and that's important in a mano combat, I would say. But, we're finding that women have better endurance. Marathon runner women, for example, women on average can endure more of the long trail, if you will. So those are very, women just bring a different set of skills to that. And I think it requires both sets of skills to be the most effective military that we have. So how do the Marine guys feel about having women in the role? Because you had some very interesting snippets here about, for example, one of the lieutenants who, when you were a second lieutenant, he was a lieutenant who really didn't appreciate you being around.
There's 2 points on that. The first is, I think there's growing pains in becoming a Marine. It's not just boot camp and then suddenly you're a Marine. I think that it takes a while to really understand what it is to be a Marine. I mean, it could take years. I think sometimes you see in the sergeant major or the colonel, the exemplar of what it is to be a Marine, but sometimes it takes a long time. Some people get it when they're a Lance Corporal, but others it takes, years in order to reach that plateau for what it means to be like a true Marine. Because of that, I think for me there was a lot of growing pains at the beginning. I grew up in a very non-traditional military environment. No one in my family had served, so there was a lot of growing pains for me to figure out not just the jargon, the lingo, but how to act like a Marine, how to say yes ma'am, yes sir, and just follow orders and deal with that. And so in my new unit,